everyone, and welcome to the second episode of Justice and Human Rights Talk series here at Northern Justice Watch. In our second episode, we have a very distinguished guest, Professor John Packer from the University of Ottawa. Professor, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So before I go ahead and start with my questions, I'd like to briefly introduce Professor Packer. Professor John Packer is a Neuberger-Jesin Professor of International Conflict Resolution in the Faculty of Law and the Director of Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa. Over his academic career, which spans across Essex Law, Fletcher School at Tufts University, Carr Center at Harvard, Lauterpacht Center at Cambridge, and following 20 years as an intergovernmental official in a number of different organizations, including UNHCR, ILO, OHCHR, UNDPA, OSCE, Professor Packer has investigated serious human rights violations in conflict situations and advised conflict actors in over 50 countries, notably in situations of intense intercommunity disputes, including genocides or risks of genocide. In recent years, he has contributed to major reports on the genocides against the Rohingya, Uyghurs, Ukrainians, and commented publicly on other situations, including testimonies before a number of parliaments. He has published and lectured around the world, edits leading journals, and is a member of numerous advisory boards. Professor Packer, it's a pleasure having you here at Northern Justice Watch. So once again, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So to move on to our questions very quickly. Professor, you worked on peace processes in many different corners of the world, worked on developing sustainable mechanisms to address these processes. Can you tell us what are the factors that make a peace process sustainable and successful, essentially?
Yeah, we've learned a lot in the last decades about peace processes. There used to be, and I think unfortunately there still is, a popular idea that some typically old, distinguished man, usually white, northern, goes into some conflict situation and behind closed doors manages to bring conflicting parties together. And, some inelegant metaphors were used, like banging heads together and things like that. And then out of this somehow emerged some kind of sensible peace arrangement, and therefore things progressed. I think that was hardly ever true. There is some element to it in ancient history. But for the last many years, we speak now more about peace processes. And these processes are typified by their multi-party, multi-dimensional character. There are many moving parts. They're hard to start. They are not linear, and they're even uncertain how you finish them. They used to be concluded by a text, an agreement. There'd be some celebratory event. But then what we discovered after that is that a great majority of them, within 2 to 5 years, reverted back into conflict. So if we're talking about a successful peace process, that's one that not only reduces, but hopefully removes violent activity, and not only is sustainable in that negative sense of peace, that there's not violence, organized violence ongoing, but that transitions, and this is a key word. We talk a lot about transitions now, which really mean political and socio-political changes, often from a system that was conflict generating. It could have been abusive, majoritarian, exploitative. It could be, it could also be some form of dictatorship that generated grievances and so forth. But how do we move from that to a system where people live together that is not only without those violent eruptions or wars, conflicts of different kinds, armed conflicts of different kinds, but a more robust kind of peace, which is to say stable, invites for investment and constructive social relations. And what we know in that regard is that we need certain systems, often of a constitutional character, which by their nature are inclusive, respond to the range of competing needs and interests, and often conflicting aspirations of different communities within society. One simple outcome of that can be what some call coexistence, but more and more we realize coexistence itself is not sufficient. We really need some kind of much more integrated cohabiting arrangement. And we know how to do that in terms of some subject matters, how we can negotiate them and resolve them. And for that, we know we need institutional capacity. It's not going to happen coming late. This is a classic problem in terms of sustainability. We used to know that we had early warning, good analysis that where things are going wrong, but we really didn't know how to make that transition to early action. And now we have a much better idea.
It's very interesting that you mentioned those at the very end about early warning and early action. I think you used the phrase mechanisms, because that's what I was planning to ask next as well. So with so much experience in the field, can you tell us a little bit about the importance of prevention and timely intervention efforts, and not just addressing it once it has happened, basically?
So both are crucial. We know absolutely, and it's an old adage that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I mean, it's actually far greater than that, right? An effective preventive engagement in terms of blood and treasure is massively more efficient and effective and desirable, right? One doesn't need to make the case conceptually that prevention is better than coming late and seeking to resolve. And for lots of reasons, right? Once people have hardened positions, once the shooting occurs and people have terrible losses, including family members and so forth, it's very hard to come back, and that space for political resolution, never mind reconciliation, becomes limited. And injustices at that point are actually not reconcilable. You cannot return to status quo ante. Now you're going to talk about forms of compensation and so forth at best. So prevention for sure is a better thing, but unfortunately, still we don't seem to learn the lesson. We still come very, very late, and that's partly because many governments, many actors are reticent to engage with particularly outside actors, or politicians are reticent or loath to accept any responsibility for wrongdoing or errors, or even leadership issues. So this is problematical, kind of getting to that early part. Prevention has been theoretized, I think correctly, already some time ago, in the distinctions between what's called structural prevention. So, for example, macroeconomic elements that allow for participation in broad economic development. Groups are not left out or losers in the kind of marketplace and so forth. And we know that there were the cases, for example, the Arab Spring, which were kind of lit, unfortunately, to use a poor metaphor, as a result of economic exclusion or suffering. So that's a kind of structural aspect to prevention, but the operational, it's sometimes called operational prevention, is closer to the moment of violent eruption, when there can be triggers. And often this relates to, for example, scapegoating certain groups, targeting others, where poor leadership, manipulative, unscrupulous conduct, and so forth and so on, which give rise to incidents which then are kind of explosive. So we know what many of those causes are. For example, Professor Ted Gurr, who created something called the Minorities at Risk Project at University of Maryland a few decades ago, and he and hundreds of scholars around the world contributed to create a database called the Minorities at Risk data set, which followed some almost 500 intercommunity relations. And he was able, after some time, to plot this and say there's actually a 10-year period between what he called the articulation of grievance, when groups start to come out and say, we're upset, something's wrong, we're angry, and the eruption of violence. I mean, that was almost to the date exactly what happened in Kosovo, for example, 10 years from when the autonomy was essentially suspended by Serbia in 1989 till 1998, 1999, when the fighting began with the UČK and so forth. So now it doesn't follow exactly like that, but I think Professor Gurr is right. There is a period of time between that articulation of grievance and when things can go really violent. And that raises the question of timeliness. How long do we wait? So we may not be able to engage on those macro structural issues. We may try through arrangements like the European Union does around fair marketplaces, mobility issues, and so forth, or the WTO, fair trading, and all the rest. But it's probably more likely that there are specific periods when attention is heightened and when readiness to consider options is increased without the violence immediately attendant. And that begs timeliness. How do we know? And the only way we know that is by being closely attuned and ready and able to act. And that, again, brings us back to institutional capacity. Who is responsible for this, and are they equipped to do it?
That's very important. Timeliness aspect, especially, I think, is something that, especially given that time period example, I mean, when you compare that and then talk a little bit about timeliness, it makes so much sense. Professor, you teach a law school course at University of Ottawa called International Peace Mediation, which I had the privilege of taking. And as a part of this course, I learned two concepts from you, important concepts that I think, namely negative and positive peace. So can you tell us a little bit about these and explain their relation to the element of accountability when it comes to, peace processes?
So the basic idea was postulated and theorized by Johan Galtung, who unfortunately passed away just a week or two ago, a renowned Norwegian sociologist and one of the co-fathers or founders of the field of peace and conflict studies. And 30, 40 years ago, he wrote a short piece, which was partly inspired by Gandhi's idea of peace, not as the absence of war and what Galtung called negative peace. So, when we don't have violent activity, are we at peace? Well, we know we're not, right? I mean, the same in our personal lives. The very fact that we're not fighting with our neighbor doesn't mean we are reposed and calm and enjoying life. And so he observed that the preoccupation of many between peace and war, or war and peace, as was then predominant, and also even in terms of legal regulation, before the Second World War, and particularly before the Geneva Conventions were more elaborated, we talked a lot about the law of peace and the law of war. And peace, again, meant the absence of war. And so Galtung said, well, that's a necessary thing. That's an important thing. Of course, we don't want to be at war, but that's not actually sufficient. Because if we really want to have sustainable peace and we want to have resilient societies that manage their differences. So he observed that conflict as such may not ever be resolved. We have conflicts in life, competitions over interests, needs, scarce resources, and so forth. How we handle those conflicts in a nonviolent way, and even better, in a constructive way, really is what we're seeking when we talk about positive peace, which is this idea of self-generating, self-regulating, and constructive social organization arrangements. Now, in terms of accountability, the problem here is that no society is absent violence in its antecedents. In fact, unfortunately, every society in the world has had violent pasts, and some very recent. And so part of the problem there is, what do we do with the wrongdoers or the perpetrators or those who, committed crimes, for example? That's hard to kind of live with or sustain a positive relation. We don't just easily forget or set aside. Now, the answer, unfortunately, is that we are not actually able to right all wrongs in historical terms. And part of the problem here is, how do we transition and live with injustices because they are unable to be resolved. A very, very bad wrongdoer, maybe who took the life of your family member, they can't perfectly restitute that. So, we have to find this living arrangement. Humanitarian law, as you probably know, actually commends the widest possible amnesties as fast as possible to return to normalcy. The idea is not for the most severe crimes, but for the range of problems. And my own view and experience is that accountability, particularly judicial recourses, is something which itself is time-consuming, resource-consuming, and retrospective in its orientation, and not so conducive to helping to move forward to, in speed, timeliness, to kind of normalcy. But accountability and these mechanisms have the advantage of a lot of time in the positive sense. There's no statute of limitation on international crimes, for example. So It may take time. You may know that even today, there are cases of persons involved in the Holocaust who are still today in their late 90s being tried, for example, or held accountable. And my view is that that's not wrong. So a lot of transitional justice now is discussed in terms of things like sequencing or alternative forms such as truth and reconciliation bodies. And I think we need to expand that and not let, if I may say, the preoccupation with accountability undermine the essential nature of a transition to sustainable peace.
And I'm assuming what you're saying especially stands for cases where these wrongdoings or crimes, maybe in different cases, have historic backgrounds where you'd have to go a long way back in order to be addressing them from an accountability perspective.
Well, for sure, that's the case. I mean, for example, I mean, you and I think right now are sitting in what is called Canada today, which we know not in time immemorial, but in recent recorded time, has been the basis of colonial occupation. And so the challenge of reconciliation in terms of accountability with Indigenous peoples, for example, is simply not going to be perfectly restituted. We're not going to go back to a time, when there were no colonizers and so forth. So, how we deal with that is going to be, and we are dealing with it, is forms of compensation, forms of accommodation, apologies. There's many different ways. We've had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission and so forth and so on. It will be unsatisfactory in some regards. But I would say that this also applies to situations with immediate, recent, extreme violence and harm. The problem in South Sudan, just to take one case, which after independence, very quickly in a year or so became a civil war. We're not going to, and I would argue it's highly unwise to seek a kind of accounting of wrongdoings of one kind of perpetrator, which are aligned not only between personalities but also with ethnic communities. This can be extremely unhelpful. This actually is conflict generating, and this is something I would go even broader to say human rights as such can be conflict generating in this kind of right and wrongdoer, perpetrator, victim paradigm. There is a tension in that with peace, achieving peace. I'm not saying to forget, and there are different ways dealing with this. For example, there can be processes of vetting. Certain persons of high crimes may be disqualified by broad consensus on participating or holding certain roles. On the other hand, the leaders of many of these groups precisely are not going to be the ones who are either going to come to such an agreement or in their cultural context may not be appropriate to then be sidelined. I mean, an attempt to sideline it would just be unrealistic. So, a lot of work still has to be done on this, but it's not just a matter of ancient history.
Yeah, no, I understand that. And so over the course of your career, I mean, you keep giving examples from different corners of the world, which obviously is a proof that you've worked in so many different places, and most of which I'm understanding being active armed conflict zones, either right before it or right after it, or maybe even during the conflict.
Right.
But nowadays we're seeing an increasing number of human rights violations in certain countries without an active armed conflict, which to some makes it a little more tricky. So how do you think the international community should engage with cases like this? We could think of Turkey as one of these, Iran being another one, or some of these other examples where that paradigm is a little different from an active armed conflict zone.
Well, first of all, I'm of the opinion that a lot of places that we thought did not have either conflict or human rights violations, in fact, were rife with both, but were partly out of sight or not reported upon or so widely suppressed. I mean, for example, I've worked in and trained diplomats in Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan is an authoritarian, repressive regime state. Now it's pretty peaceful if you want to go walk on the street. Let me tell you, I felt fairly safe walking on the street of Baghdad under Saddam Hussein because I was quite confident that the regime was in pretty good control at that time through its security apparatus and so forth. I was there as a UN staff member, with a protected status. I felt much less confident in some less authoritarian places. And so, I think we first of all have to reflect on what we mean by conflict and what we mean by human rights violations. For example, there has been a tendency historically to think civil and political rights violations as the kind of most evident and so forth, whereas there are many countries that are, quote, peaceful, but where the system has, for example, on economic or rights, clearly disadvantaged some systematically, if not systemically, for long periods of time, and so forth. So this is my first point. I think much more has been the case. And now it's coming to light through technology, through social media, and all the rest. The second thing is we used to kind of ignore that. And I think there's almost a feeling maybe it wasn't that bad. I mean, there was a terrible, sad irony. There are people, for example, in Iraq today or in Russia today, who definitely genuinely lament the loss of the former, what we would kind of analytically and unequivocally say were repressive and human rights violating regimes. But they were regimes that provided, quote, stability, delivered certain limited opportunities. I mean, Iraq, for example, had the highest quality of education in the Arab world, had the one of the best, if not the highest status of women in the Arab world, in the Middle East, at least, rights to health and so forth under the Ba'athist regime of Saddam Hussein. You simply had to completely suppress your political opinions, you know, and there was a ruthless security apparatus and so forth. So I think we need to widen our analytical lens a bit. Now, the second thing I would say is that we know now that we should not romanticize those regimes. Those people who lament it, what they're worried about is they're dealing with the uncertainty and the insecurities, economic, social, and otherwise, which now predominate in many such countries, Iraq being such a case. That's real. But we shouldn't therefore romanticize the previous regimes. And I think this is because what we know is that it was precisely those systematic human rights violating regimes and repressive regimes that under which there was this boiling cauldron of grievances and which erupted, in fact, and have given rise to not only the civil wars and so forth, but also the character of subsequent regimes. So my own view is that we need to, first of all, analytically watch such situations and know where they're leading. And, you know, I'm tired of hearing, I don't want to hear anymore one of those old arguments, which was, you know, if only we knew. So we now know exactly what's going on in Iran and in many other places, Myanmar and all the rest of it. And we know where these are leading. We know what the order of the direction of travel is, and it's not good. And so that really begs the question, what are we doing? And again, this brings us back to prevention, early engagement, and so forth.
Indeed, indeed. It's a complex dynamic, I think, especially given the examples that you're giving. We're almost running out of time, but I still have one final question that I really want to address. So here at Northern Justice Watch, we try to address these different human rights violations by taking legal steps, by trying to raise awareness, social media campaigns, and different other means. What other ways do you think are there for organizations like us to address these crimes, the violations, and most notably the perpetrators, actually?
Well, first of all, I would say that in line with the previous question or questions, we need to be prepared to engage with unpalatable actors. It's axiomatic that we make peace with our enemies, for example. But also, if we really want to change systems where there are actors that do have power, raw power, weapons, control, resources, we're going to have to somehow persuade them, whether that's through, semi-coercive incentives, disincentives, and so forth. But we're going to have to engage with them. So, this has sometimes been characterized as talking with the enemy and this kind of thing. And that's problematical even where certain groups are proscribed by law. Quote, terrorist groups. I say quote, because in international law, terrorism is not defined. And there's the old adage that, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. So we need to be kind of more sober about that. And that means for human rights and other advocates, they need to widen your palette, if I can say that, of approaches and tools. So, the mobilization of shame, which has predominantly defined how Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, many groups have behaved, that they would expose, report upon, that's all important. But the idea that that's going to result in change is quite doubtful. We're living in a shameless period of time, I would say, and where some celebrated persons are kind of exemplifying that shamelessness. So we have to think in other terms. And those, I would say, are first of all, problem solving as a method, really kind of understanding, why, for example, do such shameless, unscrupulous leaders succeed in marshaling followings? What's drawing the following? Because a lot of these, quote, bad actors would not amount to much if they didn't have significant followings. If they're not aided. So there's a whole question about complicity of those that are financing, trade in, for example, arms, but also in other ways. I think ultimately, education. There were many, again, I'll use this term, bad actors with whom I've engaged, who simply did not know alternatives, could be persuaded in less extreme positions. If they knew certain things, there were others around them, and earlier the better, right? And the last thing I'll say in this regard is the importance of conditionality. It used to be, and some in the liberal left would argue that, oh no, we can't place conditions because we don't want to penalize the Global South or something like that. I was part of the Secretariat of the World Conference on Human Rights in 1993, and leading up to it, 1992-93, there were regional conferences. And I remember in Bangkok, the World Conference regional meeting in Asia, there was an intergovernmental meeting where governments were fervently against conditionality because they didn't want their constraints on their trade and their powers. But at the NGO forum, they were unanimous. They said, please, let's have some conditionality, because the only way we're going to persuade many of these regimes to change their conduct is that they can't profit anymore from their extractiveness and exploitative conduct. And I think conditionality really works. And conditionality for good purposes, we should have no hesitation to rely upon.
Very important and very enlightening points, actually. So thank you very much, Professor Packer, for joining us at Justice and Human Rights Talks here at Northern Justice Watch and sharing your experiences. It was a pleasure having you here.
Thank you. My pleasure. And good luck with your work.
Thank you.